Hey guys, tonight we begin with a door that does not want to open. You put your shoulder into it, feel the wood shudder, and finally force a narrow crack against the wind. Snow needles through the gap. Beyond the threshold, fence posts have become white stumps. The grass has vanished, and somewhere in that moving sheet are animals that still need feed and water. Behind you, an iron stove is working hard, but the fuel pile is shrinking. That is the first surprise. On much of the treeless prairie, homesteaders could not simply solve winter with a heroic stack of firewood. Wood might be scarce or expensive. Coal cost money and transport. So families burned what the land actually gave them. Dried cow chips, twisted grass, crop waste, and carefully saved scraps. The deeper trick was not making huge amounts of heat. It was losing heat slowly enough to survive. Tonight, we are going to follow that whole system, from sod walls and stoves to blankets, barns, fuel gathering, and the dangerous chores that forced people back outside. If you enjoy these quiet journeys into practical history, like the video, subscribe, and comment with where you're listening from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pull the door shut again. The room settles into a different sound. Wind presses against the wall. Something taps in the stovepipe. A kettle ticks softly on iron. The fire is not especially dramatic because the fuel is not especially dramatic. Dried cattle manure can make useful heat, and hot coals without giving you the cheerful blaze later artists liked to put into pioneer scenes. Fuel on the plains was often a budget before it was a fire. Every armful had to come from somewhere. If wood grew along a creek, someone cut it, hauled it, dried it, and saved it. If coal came from town, someone paid for it. If cow chips were the winter reserve, someone gathered them while the weather was dry. Children could cross the prairie collecting the flat, sun-dried remains left by cattle. The house itself could do part of the work. A sod house was built from the prairie it stood on. Thick blocks of grass-rooted earth were cut, stacked, and shaped into walls that could reach roughly 2 feet in thickness. Those walls did not create warmth. They slowed the rate at which warmth escaped. That distinction is the hidden mechanism. A stove can warm air quickly. A winter wind can steal that warmth quickly. If cold air leaks through cracks and exposed walls lose heat fast. Thick earth walls resist rapid temperature change. Once the interior has warmed, every gust outside does not immediately become a gust inside. So one of the homesteaders' best heating devices was not the stove, it was the wall. Of course, the wall was still dirt, with all the housekeeping dignity that implies. But thermally, it had an advantage over thin, poorly sealed boards. You move closer to the stove. That movement matters too. 19th century homes were not heated evenly the way modern houses often are. Warmth had geography. The stove created a centre. Cooking, mending, drying clothes, talking, and resting tended to gather around it. A far corner might remain cold while someone near the iron stove was almost too warm. The goal was not to hold every room at the same comfortable temperature. The goal was to keep people functioning. That is a much smaller problem. Clothing stayed on indoors. Blankets became equipment. Curtains, rugs, and stuffed cracks helped reduce drafts. At night, bodies disappeared beneath layers of bedding where the volume of air that actually needed warming became very small. You cannot heat the prairie. Heating the whole house is expensive. But the pocket of air beneath a quilt above one body is manageable. Homesteaders kept shrinking the battlefield. Prairie to house, house to room, room to stove, stove to clothing, clothing to bed. Every step reduced the amount of space that had to be defended from the cold. But every system has a weak point. Sooner or later, someone has to leave it. The cow in the barn does not care that your blanket is warm. Neither does the frozen water source, the drift packed against a door, or the livestock waiting beyond the white blur. During a severe storm, The most dangerous part of staying warm could be the moment the system required a person to go outside. A childhood recollection preserved by the National Park Service describes one prairie family during a terrible blizzard. The father tied a clothesline between the sod house and the sod barn, so he and the older boys could move back and forth to care for the milk cows and oxen without losing their way. The barn was close enough to be an ordinary walk on a normal day. During the blizzard, sight could no longer be trusted. A rope became navigation. The same recollection describes the family twisting long, coarse, slow grass for stove fuel. They packed the grass tightly into metal drums that could feed the cooking stove because there was little wood nearby and coal was too expensive for them. Now the heating system becomes more complicated. Shelter preserved heat, but shelter depended on fuel. Fuel depended on labor. Labor sometimes depended on leaving shelter, and leaving shelter depended on finding your way home again. Warmth was not an object, it was a chain. Preparation began long before the storm. Winter fuel could be gathered in summer, grass could be cut and stacked, dried chips could be collected, buildings could be patched while hands still worked easily outdoors. Once a blizzard arrived, every missing bundle of fuel and every loose crack became harder to fix. Distance mattered too. The stove was inside. Animals were in the barn. Water might be outside. Feed might be stored somewhere else. A storm turned short walks into exposure, so the space between ordinary necessities became a cost measured in body heat. You feel that cost when the door opens again. Cold air falls across the floor. Snow comes in on boots, wet mittens must dry, and the stove must replace heat lost through the doorway. This is why the usual image of frontier toughness misses something important. The system worked not because people were magically tougher than cold. It worked because they organized life around cold. They changed buildings, fuel, work, sleeping arrangements, clothing, storage and movement. They used earth as insulation, livestock waste as fuel, rope as navigation, and routine as a defense against surprise. None of that made winter pleasant. It made winter negotiable. And there was always a price. Burning poor fuel meant smoke, soot, ash, and constant tending. A sod house that held heat could still be dark, cramped, dirty, and difficult to maintain. Conserving warmth often meant concentrating daily life into a small circle around the stove. Comfort narrowed. So did freedom of movement. That is the first, deeper truth of prairie winter. Staying warm was not mainly about producing heat. It was about organizing a household so precious heat moved through as few leaks, distances, and unnecessary spaces as possible. The fire mattered, but the system around the fire mattered more. And once we understand that, the next question becomes unavoidable. What happened when that system reached its limit? When fuel ran low, snow buried the route outside, animals still needed care, and even the walls could no longer keep enough cold from creeping in. The weak point usually arrives before the fire goes out. It begins with something smaller. A boot is wet, a mitten is stiff, the water bucket has a skin of ice across the top, and the draft beneath the door feels sharper than it did an hour ago. You notice these details because winter on the prairie does not always defeat a household in one spectacular moment. More often, it works by making ordinary tasks harder until every task starts stealing heat. You still need water, you still need food, you still need to feed animals, you still need to remove ash from the stove, bring in fuel, mend a crack, clear a doorway, and dry whatever came back inside covered with snow. The household stays warm only if those jobs keep moving. That makes labor part of the heating system. A sod house helps because the thick earth walls resist rapid temperature change, but insulation is not the same thing as heat. Once the stove cools, the room begins giving back what warmth it has stored. A well-insulated shelter buys time. It does not cancel winter. So you kneel beside the stove and open the iron door. The fire has settled. If you have wood, you add a split piece. If wood is scarce, the choices become less familiar. Dried cow chips can burn. Twisted prairie or slow grass can burn. Crop residues can burn. Each fuel behaves differently, and none appears by magic beside the stove. Someone gathered it, someone dried it, someone hauled it, someone kept it out of the weather. On farms where timber was scarce and coal too expensive, that preparation could begin months before the first serious cold. Children might gather dried cattle chips in warm weather. Grass could be cut and stacked. Anything that could later produce useful heat acquired a second identity. Waste became winter insurance. But low-density fuel creates another problem. You need volume. A small piece of good firewood contains concentrated energy and can burn for a useful length of time. A bundle of dry grass may flare faster. That means feeding the stove more often, storing more bulk, and spending more labour for the same basic result, keeping one small room habitable. The stove also needs air. That sounds obvious until you remember what people are trying to do everywhere else in the house. They are blocking drafts, stuffing cracks, closing doors, hanging fabric, reducing the movement of cold air, but combustion itself depends on airflow, and the smoke still has to leave through a stovepipe or chimney. A heating system therefore cannot simply seal the house completely. It has to control where air enters and where hot gases escape. Too much leakage wastes heat. Too little draft makes the stove work badly. Warmth lives in the compromise. You feel another compromise beneath your feet. Floors could be cold even when the air near the stove was tolerable. In modest sod houses, construction varied widely. Some had plank floors, others had packed earth floors. Windows admitted precious daylight, but also created thinner points in a thick wall. Doors had to open. Roofs had seams. Every improvement brought a material cost, and every missing improvement showed up somewhere in the body. Cold toes are architectural criticism. So people adapted themselves to the warmest parts of the building. Work migrated inward. The chair moves closer to the stove. Clothing hangs where heat can reach it. The child doing a small indoor chore stays within the warmer zone. The family does not need to make every cubic foot of the dwelling equally pleasant. It concentrates activity where the available heat is already going. Then someone looks toward the door. The animals. This is where the house stops being the whole story. A homestead was not merely a shelter with people inside it. It was a network of dependencies spread across open ground. Milk cows, oxen, horses, chickens, stored feed, water, tools, and outbuildings could all sit outside the warmest enclosure. The colder the weather becomes, the more dangerous those few yards can become. During a blizzard, blowing snow can erase familiar landmarks. A barn visible from the door in ordinary weather may disappear into white. National Park Service records preserve an account of one family stretching a clothesline between a sod house and a sod barn so the father and older boys could move back and forth while tending their milk cows and oxen. Think about what that rope is doing. It is not producing heat. It is protecting the labour required to maintain the system that produces survival. Without care, animals suffer. Without animals, a family may lose milk, traction, transport, meat, breeding stock, or the power needed for farm work after winter. So the trip to the barn cannot simply be cancelled. The rope turns a blind walk into a guided one. One hand follows the line. Boots search for footing. Wind presses against clothing. The barn finally appears only when you are almost on top of it. Inside, the air may still be bitter, but animals themselves produce heat. A small enclosed barn can feel different from the open prairie because walls stop the wind. Bedding insulates bodies from the ground, and living animals continuously release warmth. Again, the principle is not luxury, it is reducing loss. You feed quickly because every minute matters. Hay must be reachable. Water must not be hopelessly frozen. A sick or exhausted animal creates another demand on the household. Winter punishes systems with long distances and poor preparation because every emergency requires exposure. Then you follow the rope back. The house is invisible until suddenly it is there. You open the door and carry a cloud of cold air inside with you. Now the stove must warm not only the room, but you. Your outer clothing is damp. Snow melts. Boots begin to steam near the heat. Fingers ache as circulation returns. A family that repeatedly sends people outdoors is constantly moving cold and moisture across its own threshold. This is why clothing and drying are not separate from heating. They are part of the same thermal budget. Wet fabric conducts heat away from the body more efficiently than dry layers, so a mitten that fails to dry tonight becomes tomorrow morning's problem. Boots left frozen become harder to put on. Damp bedding is worse. Clothing therefore cycles through the warm zone around the stove just as fuel does. The room becomes a workshop for preserving dryness. That makes crowding useful, even when it is uncomfortable. People, clothing, food preparation, repair work, and rest all gather in the same limited warm space, because dividing the house into specialized rooms would divide the heat too. Modern comfort tends to spread out. Winter survival tends to contract, and contraction keeps appearing at every scale. You shorten the outdoor trip. You close unused space. You gather around the stove. You layer clothing. You sleep under heavier bedding. You store fuel where it can be reached. You move necessities closer whenever possible. The household becomes physically smaller, without the walls moving at all. That is the second mechanism behind prairie warmth. The first was slowing heat loss. The second is reducing the number of places heat must go. But neither mechanism can solve one final problem. Fuel is finite. The stove consumes your reserve every hour it burns, and a long cold spell does not care how carefully you planned for an ordinary winter. At some point, warmth becomes arithmetic. How much fuel remains? How fast are you burning it? How many nights might the cold last, and what can you afford to stop heating first? The arithmetic begins with the stove door. You open it only long enough to see what remains: a few red coals, a grey crust of ash, enough heat to work with, but not enough to waste. If the weather outside is merely cold, you can burn more freely. If the wind has been hard for 2 days and your fuel stack is shrinking, every handful begins to carry a future attached to it. Burn it now, and the room warms. Save it, and you may have something left before dawn. Prairie families sometimes faced this calculation with fuels that were bulky, fast-burning, or expensive to replace. In treeless parts of Nebraska, dried cattle dung became common enough to earn the cheerful name prairie coal. It burned with little flame, but could leave hot coals useful for heating and cooking. Cornstalks and grass could also be fed into stoves, though loose plant material demanded frequent attention. So the person tending the fire becomes a kind of clock. Add fuel, wait. Listen, add more. A stove burning grass does not care that everyone is sleepy. This changes the rhythm of the household. Heat is no longer a background service. It is something somebody maintains with hands. A weak fire may be encouraged before cooking. A stronger one may be justified when wet clothing needs drying. Later, when the meal is finished and bodies are going under blankets, the family can allow the room itself to become colder. Because the room is not where the night's real insulation lives, the bed is. You cross the floor and pull back layers of bedding. What matters here is not that 19th century families possessed some secret kind of blanket. The mechanism is simpler. Bedding traps small layers of air close to the body. Several sleepers sharing a bed can also reduce the amount of exposed surface around each person and contribute heat to the same enclosed space. The house may be cold. The air beneath the covers does not have to be, once again. Winter is beaten by shrinking the problem during the day. The household gathers around the stove at night. The defended space contracts to mattresses, quilts, blankets, clothing, and bodies. You do not spend fuel trying to make the ceiling comfortable. The ceiling has no opinion. That sounds almost comical until you notice what a major difference it makes. Modern central heating encourages us to think in room temperatures. Prairie survival often worked in zones. The stove zone might be warm, the far wall might be cold, the floor might be colder still. A bed could become tolerable even while frost formed elsewhere. There is no contradiction. A house can be cold and still keep people alive. The distinction between warm and warm enough matters. Now consider the walls around you. A carefully built sod house might have earth walls 2 feet thick. Historical descriptions from Nebraska record houses with walls of this order, and National Register documentation explicitly notes that thick sod walls held heat better than frame walls using comparable fuel. The same mass that slowed summer heat from entering also slowed winter warmth from escaping. But thermal mass works slowly. If you let the interior become deeply cold, reheating it takes effort. The earth, floor, furniture, iron stove, cookware, and everything else inside are not passive spectators. They absorb heat too. That encourages another practical strategy. Avoid unnecessary swings. Keep the core of the household going. Do not let every useful surface freeze if you can help it. Do not open doors longer than necessary. Do not burn tomorrow's fuel merely to make tonight luxurious. A homesteader writing from Nebraska in December 1884 recorded temperatures around 22 degrees below zero during a bitter stretch of snow and cold. His Christmas Eve plan was wonderfully modest. Sit by the fire in his sod house. That fire is doing more than warming hands. It is protecting stored food from deeper freezing where possible. It is heating water. It is drying cloth. It is making cooking possible. It may warm a flat iron or a vessel of water that can carry heat away from the stove for a while. One source of combustion supports several household functions because fuel is too valuable to think of each task separately. Cooking and heating naturally overlap. A pot on the stove uses heat already being produced. Steam adds moisture to very dry winter air, though too much interior moisture can create its own problems on cold surfaces. Warm food and drink do not magically raise the body's temperature for hours, but they make cold living more tolerable and supply energy to a body spending calories simply staying warm and working. Food then belongs in the thermal system too. So does fatigue. Cold weather raises the cost of every chore. Carrying fuel through snow takes effort. Breaking ice takes effort. Handling animals takes effort. Heavy clothing makes movement clumsier. Fingers lose dexterity. A task that takes 10 minutes in autumn can consume much longer in a storm. That means labor cannot be treated as unlimited. The family is budgeting human energy along with fuel. Who goes outside? Who stays near the youngest child? Who tends the stove? Who cooks? Who carries water? Who feeds livestock? Who has dry mittens left? The answers change with age, health, household size, weather, and what resources the farm possesses. There was no single prairie routine shared by every homesteader. A prosperous family with access to coal and a substantial frame house faced a different winter from a newly arrived claimant living in a small sod dwelling. A family near timber had options that a household on open grassland did not. The environment sets constraints. Money rearranges them. This is where warmth begins revealing class. Coal transported by rail could reduce dependence on gathered fuels as rail networks expanded. Purchased lumber could improve floors, doors, roofs, and later housing. Better stoves could make fuel use easier to control. More animals might provide both economic security and more chores. A larger house offered space, but more space could also mean more air and surface area to heat. Improvement did not always mean a simpler thermal problem. Sometimes the humble soddy had an advantage precisely because it was small and thick. You can feel the irony while sitting beside the stove. The house that looked poorest from the road might hold heat surprisingly well. The house that looked more civilized in sawn lumber might leak warmth through thinner walls and more exposed surfaces, unless it was carefully built and supplied with fuel. Winter does not care much about appearances. It cares about physics. By late evening, the fire is lowered again. Clothes needed tomorrow have been brought close enough to dry. Water has been carried in. The animals have been checked. Food is put away. Fuel for the next lighting is positioned where sleepy hands can reach it. These are tiny decisions. Together they create the night. You climb into bed wearing more clothing than a modern heated bedroom would require. The room cools. The stove ticks as the iron contracts. Wind presses against earth walls that give it almost nothing to grab. And now another problem emerges. A household can ration heat by retreating into bed. Livestock cannot. Water cannot. Stored food cannot always be allowed to freeze, and tomorrow morning, someone must restart the entire chain. The question is no longer simply how to survive a cold night. It is how to keep a farm alive through a winter that refuses to end. Morning does not begin when you wake. It begins when the farm starts demanding things. The stove wants fuel. The animals want feed. Water has to move somehow, even when the landscape seems to have forgotten the difference between ground and sky. You pull on yesterday's dry layers, if they are dry, and step toward the door. Outside, the wind has rearranged the property. A drift has formed against one wall. The path you cleared yesterday is gone. The barn roof is still visible, but the lower half of the building seems to have sunk into snow. That is another prairie winter trick. Snow is not just cold material lying on the ground. Wind moves it. Fences, walls, sheds, haystacks, and small changes in terrain interrupt the airflow, and snow collects around them. A doorway that was clear at dusk can be blocked by morning. So before you can care for the farm, you may have to excavate your way into it. The shovel bites into packed snow. You clear enough space for the door to move. Not a beautiful path, not a wide path, just enough. Efficiency keeps returning because every unnecessary minute outside is expensive. Now the barn. A barn or stable does not need to feel warm to help livestock. Its first job in severe weather is often less ambitious. Stop the wind. Keep bedding drier. And give animals a protected place where the heat their bodies already produce is not stripped away so quickly. Wind matters enormously. An animal standing in still cold air faces one problem. Put the same animal in strong wind, and moving air continually carries heat away from its body. Shelter changes that exchange without generating a single new unit of heat. Once again, the cheapest warmth is heat you do not lose. But livestock cannot survive on shelter alone. They need feed. Hay is stored summer sunlight in a form a winter animal can eat. Grass cut during the growing season, dried, stacked, and protected, becomes a reserve of energy when snow covers pasture or storms make grazing difficult. In western Nebraska, ranchers and homesteaders planned around hay because a severe storm could make access to feed urgent. A 1913 newspaper account preserved by History Nebraska describes women homesteaders traveling with a load of hay specifically meant to supply livestock during an approaching winter storm. The important part is not the dramatic journey. It is the timing. You cannot grow hay during a blizzard. Winter survival depends on work completed when winter is absent. Cut, dry, stack, store, then hope the stack remains reachable. A drift between the hay and the animals can turn stored abundance into temporary scarcity. The feed exists, but the distance between need and supply has become hostile. You shoulder what you can carry. Hay catches against your coat. Fine pieces work down your collar. The wind tries to take the loose stems before the animals do. Inside the shelter, hungry animals push forward. Feeding them is not merely an act of kindness or habit. Their bodies need energy to maintain temperature. Severe cold increases the importance of adequate feed, particularly when animals are exposed to wind or moisture. For a homesteading family, losing an ox, horse, milk cow, or other valuable stock could also damage the farm long after the storm passed. That animal may be next spring's traction, next month's milk, transport to town, breeding stock, cash. One freezing night can reach forward into planting season, so the winter household is constantly protecting the future while trying to survive the present. Then comes water. This can be worse. Liquid water is heavy. Animals require a lot of it. Wells, pumps, troughs, streams, and containers can all become difficult in freezing weather. Depending on place and period, families might draw from wells, carry water, break surface ice, or use whatever local supply their homestead allowed. No single method describes every farm, but the constraint is universal enough. Snow outside does not automatically mean convenient drinking water. Melting snow seems like an obvious solution until you try it. A bucket of loose snow contains a surprising amount of air. melt it, and the volume collapses. More snow must be gathered. Then the stove must supply the heat to bring that frozen water through melting and, if you want it warm, beyond, that spends fuel, the same fuel warming the house. So even water can become part of the firewood arithmetic. For people a small amount may be manageable. For several large animals, relying on melted snow alone would often be inefficient compared with access to a functioning water source. The farm therefore needs routes house to fuel, house to barn, barn to feed, house or barn to water. Each route has to remain possible. A prairie homestead that looks simple on a summer afternoon becomes a network under winter stress. Distance, wind direction, building placement, stored supplies, and the condition of paths suddenly matter because the body must carry something through every connection. Food goes one way, water goes another, ash comes out, manure accumulates, milk may come back toward the house, wet clothing returns with the worker. Every movement transfers matter, and almost every movement transfers heat. This is why a winter storm can produce a strange form of confinement. You are trapped indoors, but you cannot simply stay indoors. The more dangerous outside becomes, the more carefully you must choose the moments when you enter it. Historical accounts of Great Plains blizzards repeatedly emphasize how quickly visibility and orientation could collapse. The January 12, 1888 storm, later remembered as the Children's Blizzard, swept across much of Dakota Territory and Nebraska after comparatively pleasant weather and became one of the region's most notorious winter disasters. The lesson for a farm is brutally practical. Knowing where the barn stands is not the same as being able to find it. 20 yards can become a navigation problem. That explains ropes and lines between buildings. It also explains why chores performed before conditions worsened could be so valuable. Feed animals before the storm peaks. Bring fuel closer, fill containers, check doors, move what can be moved. Preparation converts outdoor work into indoor time, and indoor time is safer. Not comfortable, safer. You return to the house with snow crusted around your boots. Before entering, you knock off what you can. Snow brought indoors becomes water. Water on a floor becomes dampness. Damp clothing has to be dried with heat you already worked to preserve. The door opens. For a moment, warm air leaves and cold air enters. Then it closes. The stove is still going. That small fact feels different now. The fire has survived your absence. But so have the animals. There is feed in front of them. Water has been dealt with. The route remains open enough for the next trip. Nothing heroic has happened. That is exactly the point. A functioning homestead survives winter through hundreds of ordinary successes that prevent the dramatic emergency from arriving. A latch works. A fuel pile stays dry. A mitten dries before morning. A cow eats. A path remains findable. The stove catches on the first attempt. The household does not conquer the storm. It keeps reducing the number of ways the storm can win. But there is one part of that system no wall, haystack, or stove can fully control. Weather can change faster than people can prepare for it. And on the plains, that could turn an ordinary chore into a life or death decision in a matter of hours. By noon, the weather can lie to you. The morning may have been mild enough to make heavy clothing feel unnecessary. Snow on the ground can soften. Animals move normally. A trip to the barn feels routine. Then the wind changes. At first, you notice it on your cheek, then on the side of the house. Then the horizon disappears. On January 12, 1888, one of the most infamous Great Plains blizzards arrived with exactly this kind of betrayal. The day had begun comparatively pleasant in many places, then a fast-moving cold front swept across the region. By early afternoon, the storm had covered much of Dakota Territory, western Nebraska, and neighboring areas. In some places, telegraph lines failed before cold wave warnings could arrive. That matters because warmth depends on timing. A warning received before the wind rises can change everything. You bring in more fuel. You fill containers. You feed animals early. You move tools. You keep children home. You tie a line between buildings. You close the system before the prairie becomes dangerous. a warning received afterward is almost useless. The 19th century Great Plains had weather observers, telegraph networks, newspapers, and eventually increasingly organized forecasting. But those systems were thin compared with what surrounds you today. A forecast did not appear instantly in every household. Messages moved through offices, telegraph lines, towns, railway stations, newspapers, flags, and word of mouth. A remote homestead could sit only a few miles from information and still be effectively outside it. The storm could arrive first. That turns weather knowledge into another kind of insulation. Not insulation against cold air, insulation against bad timing. You stand in the doorway and watch the light flatten. The barn is still visible. This is when the decision matters. Do you go now? If the cows need feed, waiting may make the trip harder. But if the storm intensifies while you are outside, a short chore can become dangerous. The problem is not simply the temperature. It is the combination of wind, visibility, moisture, distance, and uncertainty. A clear path can disappear while you are using it. Blowing snow reduces contrast. Fence lines vanish. Buildings blend into whiteness. Familiar ground becomes difficult to read because almost every visual reference has been removed. The human body is not especially good at walking straight without references. You can drift. You can turn slightly without noticing. You can miss a building that is close enough to hear under better conditions. That is why a rope between house and barn is such a powerful object. It converts vision into touch. One hand stays on the line. As long as the line remains anchored, the storm can erase the landscape without erasing the route. The rope is a primitive navigation system built from almost nothing, and it reveals something important about prairie survival. Homesteaders often did not defeat a dangerous condition directly. They changed which sense, tool, or routine the condition was allowed to disrupt. If visibility failed, use touch. If wood failed, use another fuel. If the room could not stay warm, shrink the warm zone. If travel became dangerous, shorten or mark the route. Survival came from substitution. But substitution has limits. The wind reaches you before you reach the barn. It pushes cold air through seams in clothing. Snow catches at the collar. Your eyelashes collect moisture. Breathing into cloth can make the cloth damp. Hands that felt fine near the stove become clumsy. Wind chill, as a modern numerical index, did not exist in the form homesteaders would recognize, but the physical effect certainly did. Moving air increases heat loss from exposed skin by continually replacing the thin layer of warmed air near the body. The important point is not the number printed on a weather report, it is the speed of the change. A person dressed for the morning may be badly dressed for the afternoon. That is what made sudden storms especially dangerous. The January 1888 blizzard became known in part because so many school children and teachers were caught away from home. It killed hundreds across the northern plains. The tragedy is often remembered through schools, but the same weather mechanism threatened anyone separated from shelter when conditions collapsed. Farm work creates exactly that exposure. A person may be in a field, at a neighbour's, on the road, at the barn, hauling hay, fetching water, going to town. Warmth only protects you while you can still reach it. That makes distance itself a winter hazard. Now the barn finally emerges through the snow. Inside, you close the door behind you. The difference is immediate. It may still be far below what you would call comfortable, but the wind stops. That one change transforms the experience. Your clothing can begin holding a more stable layer of warm air. The animals are no longer standing in moving wind. Loose hay stops flying. Shelter turns violent cold into stationary cold. That is a major improvement. You work quickly. Feed is pulled down. A frozen latch gets struck against wood. You check water. You look at the animals closely because severe cold can hide problems until they become expensive. Then you turn back toward the house. The rope disappears into white. You take it in one gloved hand. There is something almost absurd about how little technology separates confidence from panic here. A cord. 2 anchors. A known route, but useful systems are often unimpressive when they work. The spectacular part is the storm. The survival mechanism may be a knot tied correctly before it arrives. Back inside, the door closes and the heating problem starts again. Snow melts from clothing. The stove receives more fuel. Wet layers are placed where they can dry. Someone checks the remaining reserve, and now the storm has introduced a new problem. Even if the house is secure, transportation may not be. Rail lines can drift shut. Roads disappear. Telegraph wires can fail. Mail stops. A household that expected to buy coal, food, lamp fuel, or other supplies may suddenly discover that the nearest town is functionally much farther away than it was yesterday. The January 1888 storm, for example, blocked rail traffic and disrupted telegraph communication in parts of the region. Isolation changes the meaning of storage. A sack of flour is not just food. A pile of coal is not just fuel. Hay is not just animal feed. They are time. Every stored necessity represents days during which the household does not have to expose itself to obtain another one. The better the reserve, the longer the farm can remain closed against the weather. That is why winter preparation begins looking less like comfort and more like logistics. You are not merely stocking objects. You are buying future indoor hours themselves. And this is where a severe prairie winter starts exposing the deepest weakness in the homestead system. The household can conserve heat, it can improvise fuel, it can mark routes, it can prepare for storms, but it cannot produce supplies indefinitely. If cold lasts long enough, every reserve begins moving towards zero. Then the question changes again. What happens when survival is no longer about making it through tonight, but about stretching limited food, fuel, and strength across weeks of winter? The first thing to ration is rarely the thing you expect. You might think it is food, sometimes it is, but in a long prairie winter, a household can begin rationing movement before it rations meals. Every trip outside costs something. A trip to the fuel pile costs body heat. A trip to the barn costs time, clothing, and calories. A trip to town may cost an entire day, and if the weather closes in, much more. So the household starts asking a quiet question. Can this task wait? That question changes everything. You bring more fuel inside at once so the door opens fewer times. You combine chores. If someone is going to the barn, they carry what else needs to go. If water has to come in, containers are filled as fully as strength allows. Winter rewards consolidation. The stove makes this visible. A strong fire feels good, but a strong fire also consumes tomorrow. So the aim becomes steadiness rather than abundance. Enough heat to cook, enough to dry, enough to keep the occupied space tolerable. Not enough to pretend the season is not happening. People still want ordinary life. They want a warm seat, a hot meal, dry socks, a room where children can move without being told to stay near the stove. But scarcity narrows choice. The fuel pile is the clearest measure. A family with nearby timber has one kind of problem. A family with coal money has another. A family relying heavily on twisted grass, corn residue, or cow chips may have enough combustible material, but not enough concentrated heat to make tending the stove easy. Low-density fuels demand handling. You gather them, store them, carry them, feed them, then do it again. The labor hidden inside a warm room can be enormous, and labor itself needs food. Now the household economy closes into a loop. Fuel keeps people warm enough to work. Work brings in fuel. Food keeps people strong enough to work. Livestock consume stored feed but may provide milk, meat, transport, or traction. Animals must survive because they are part of the farm's future. Every resource depends on another. That is why a severe winter can become dangerous before anything completely runs out. The system becomes brittle. A healthy adult can haul fuel. An injured one cannot. A dry boot can go to the barn. A soaked boot may freeze. A stove with a clear flue can draw properly. A damaged stovepipe can turn heating into a smoke problem. One failure creates extra work, and extra work consumes reserves meant for something else. You can see the same logic in food. A winter meal depends on what was stored, preserved, dried, salted, canned, smoked, milled, or otherwise carried into the cold months. Potatoes, flour, cornmeal, beans, preserved meat, dairy, and preserved fruits or vegetables might appear depending on region, household, season, and prosperity. There is no universal homesteader menu. The important thing is that stored food is another form of delayed summer. Someone planted it, raised it, harvested it, preserved it. The pantry is a calendar you can eat, and, like the fuel stack, it becomes shorter as weeks pass. Households begin seeing time physically. The flour bin lowers, the haystack shrinks, the pile of chips becomes scattered pieces, the stack of wood exposes the wall behind it. Every reduction asks how much winter remains. That uncertainty matters because winter has no fixed appointment with comfort. A mild stretch may arrive, or another cold wave. A family that spends too freely during a temporary improvement can regret it when the wind returns. So restraint becomes protection. You do not need to be starving to save food. You do not need to be freezing to save fuel. You save because you do not know the length of the demand. This is where warmth becomes psychological without requiring anyone to be heroic. The system works partly because people take uncertainty seriously enough to prepare for it. Another bucket, another bundle, another sack, another dry pair of socks. Ordinary reserves reduce the number of emergencies tomorrow can create. That also explains why waste matters. A door left open too long is wasted heat. A wet blanket is wasted insulation. A roof leak can wet bedding and fuel. A spilled bucket means another trip. A poorly protected haystack can spoil. A broken tool can make the next chore slower. None of these problems is dramatic alone. Together, they can decide whether the household remains uncomfortable or moves into real danger. You begin to understand why maintenance becomes winter work. Handles are repaired indoors. Harness is checked. Clothing is patched. Boots are dried. Ash is cleared, fuel is sorted, small tasks remove future friction. The goal is to make tomorrow require fewer surprises. And some things cannot be stored. Light, for one. Winter shortens the useful day. A lamp can extend it, but lamp fuel is another consumable. Candles are consumable, firelight exists anyway, but it is uneven and poor for detailed work. So activity follows daylight more closely. The farm may demand an early start, but cold morning darkness slows movement. Evening arrives before the work feels finished. Indoor tasks crowd into hours when lamp or stove light can support them. The household contracts not only in space, it contracts in time. More work must fit into the safest, brightest, warmest part of the day. That creates another reason to organize tasks carefully. Do the outdoor job when visibility is better. Carry enough to avoid repeating the trip. Repair gear before darkness. Set aside morning fuel before bed. Place boots where they can dry. Little efficiencies accumulate. They are not exciting. They are survival made boring, which is usually how successful survival looks. Then winter applies pressure somewhere else. Maybe a child becomes sick. Maybe an animal stops eating. Maybe a roof starts leaking during a thaw and refreezes at night. Maybe a stove part cracks. Maybe snow closes the route to town longer than expected. Now the reserve begins doing the job it was saved for. Extra fuel buys time. Stored food buys time. Dry clothing buys time. A neighbour within reach may buy time. The purpose of preparation is to turn catastrophe into inconvenience. But preparation also reveals inequality. Not every homesteader begins winter with the same reserve. One family may have money for coal, a better barn, stronger tools, and enough food to absorb a bad month. Another may have arrived recently, spent heavily establishing a claim, and entered winter with an unfinished house and little margin. The temperature can be identical, the risk is not. A bitter night does not ask whether your roof was completed before the first snow. It only exposes the answer. This is what frontier mythology flattens when survival becomes a story about toughness. Endurance matters, skill matters, but materials matter, cash matters, neighbors matter, timing matters. A well-built shelter matters, the hay stacked before winter matters, the condition of a stove matters, the distance to fuel matters. The difference between surviving comfortably and surviving narrowly may be something as dull as whether another load of coal arrived in October. Outside, the wind keeps working. Inside, the family keeps reducing demands, one room instead of several, one trip instead of 3, one steady fire instead of a roaring one repair made tonight instead of an emergency tomorrow. The household is not creating more resources, it is making each resource do more jobs. And eventually, that leads to the most important resource that cannot be stacked in a corner: other people. Because when a homestead has stretched its own reserves as far as they can go, warmth may depend on whether anyone else is close enough to help. A neighbour can be 3 miles away and still be part of your heating system. Not every day, not every storm, but when something important breaks, distance begins to mean something different. You notice it first when the stove starts drawing badly. The fire is alive, but smoke hesitates instead of climbing cleanly. Maybe the wind is forcing air down the flue, maybe soot has built up. Maybe a joint in the stovepipe has shifted. Whatever the cause, the result is immediate. The room that depends on one iron box now depends on repairing that box. You can solve some problems yourself. A loose pipe can be reset, ash can be cleared. But not every household has every tool. Spare part, animal, wagon, or able pair of hands it might suddenly need. That is where the map of winter expands. There is your house, your barn, your fuel, and then there is the nearest household that might have what you do not. Helping neighbours was common enough on the plains that settlers organised work gatherings, often called bees, for jobs such as building barns or houses, ploughing and husking corn. Some tasks are simply more efficient when 10 hands appear instead of 2. Winter makes that logic sharper. Suppose a drift collapses part of a path. 2 people shovel faster than 1. Suppose a family runs short of fuel. A neighbour with a larger reserve may be able to spare enough to bridge a few days. Suppose someone is sick. Then the person who normally hauls water, feeds livestock, or tends the fire may suddenly be unavailable. The missing labour has to come from somewhere. You do not have to imagine a frontier where everybody loved everybody. They did not. Neighbours could quarrel over land, livestock, fences, water, politics, debt, religion, or almost anything else human beings have ever managed to quarrel about. Community support was valuable precisely because cooperation did not require perfect harmony. It required recognition of shared risk. Your neighbour's barn fire today could be your broken wagon next month. The landscape taught reciprocity with very little poetry. You walk toward the door again. The wind has eased. That makes the trip possible, not pleasant. You pull on layers and take something with you, perhaps food, a tool, a message, or simply your own labour. Assistance often arrives as a person, no heated truck, no utility crew, no road service. A body comes through the cold carrying what it can. That body must also stay warm, dress dry, cover exposed skin, keep moving, know the route, do not remain outside longer than the job requires. The social network still operates through human metabolism. You reach the neighbouring place and immediately see how different 2 homesteads can be. This house may have a better stove. That family may have less fuel. One barn may be tighter. Another may shelter more animals. One household may have older children capable of heavy work. Another may have a baby, illness, or only one adult available. Winter is shared, but vulnerability is uneven. That matters because the romantic image of self-sufficiency can hide the arithmetic of survival. A claim may belong to one household. Its risks do not remain neatly inside the property line. Historical accounts from the plains describe neighbours gathering to help one another with major work, and later memoirs from ranching communities state the principle even more plainly. If people did not help one another, many would not have survived frontier conditions. That statement makes more sense when you translate it into objects. A borrowed axe, a team of horses, a sack of food, a few buckets of coal, a repaired roof, a ride to town, a place to sleep. Community becomes visible only when something moves from one household to another, and warmth is one of the things that can move. Not literally, at first. What moves is fuel, labour, information, shelter, a warning. Then those things become warmth once they reach the right place. Consider information. A traveller coming from town can bring word that the weather is worsening. A neighbour can report that a road is blocked. Someone may know where coal is available, which well is still working, or whose livestock escaped during the storm. Information prevents wasted trips. A wasted trip in winter is not merely inconvenient, it burns daylight, food energy, animal energy, and body heat. Good information is therefore another form of conservation. Now consider shelter. If a traveller is caught between destinations, the nearest inhabited house can matter more than the correct house. Opening a door to someone uses fuel. It introduces cold air. It may require food and bedding. Hospitality has a material cost, but refusing shelter in severe conditions can have a far larger human cost. So a warm room becomes a community resource under certain circumstances. That does not mean every frontier family lived in continuous, cheerful cooperation. It means isolation had a price, and people learned where cooperation reduced it. Even larger relief systems sometimes appeared when local hardship exceeded what households could absorb. During the severe drought and economic distress of the 1890s, organizations in Nebraska appealed for food, clothing, and fuel for struggling Western settlers. Coal could be gathered far from the affected homesteads, transported, then distributed to families who lacked enough of their own. Now the heating system stretches across the state. A stove in a Western home can depend on people who never see that home. Someone donates. Someone organizes. A railroad carries the load. Someone distributes it. Then, days or weeks later, a piece of coal becomes heat in a room. This is the opposite of the lone homesteader myth. The farther you follow warmth backward, the more people appear. Cow chips require cattle. Coal depends on mines, railroads, money, and merchants. A stove depends on manufacturing and transport. Lumber depends on sawmills and freight. Homesteading looks most independent when you stop tracing the dependencies too soon. Winter forces you to keep tracing them. Back at your own house, someone knocks snow from a coat near the door. A neighbour has come in. Either way, another body changes the room slightly. People give off heat. Several people in a small enclosed space can noticeably affect how that space feels, though no sensible household would invite guests as a substitute for fuel. Still, gathering has another advantage. Work can be shared while everyone remains within the same warm zone. Clothing is repaired, food is prepared, news is exchanged, plans are made. A person who knows how to fix something can do it without another household learning the same skill from failure. Knowledge moves cheaply. That may be the most efficient resource in the room. One person knows how to bank a wall against drafts, another knows how to handle a difficult animal. Someone else recognizes the warning signs of cold injury sooner. A technique learned once can protect several households without being consumed. Fuel disappears when used. Knowledge does not, and that distinction becomes more important as winter deepens. The homestead is no longer just a small fortress trying to hold heat against the prairie. It is one warm point in a scattered network of other warm points. The distances between them can be dangerous. But the connections can keep a bad winter from becoming an impossible one. Then another question appears. If neighbours, railroads, merchants, tools, animals and stored supplies are all part of staying warm, how independent was the homesteader ever supposed to be? And what happened when the systems beyond the farm failed at the same time as the weather closed in? The failure beyond the farm begins quietly. A train does not arrive, that is all. No dramatic crash, no broken bridge in sight. Just an empty stretch of track where a load of coal, flour, kerosene, nails, feed, or mail was expected to appear. For a household already living close to its winter margin, absence can be as serious as damage. You stand beside the stove and look at the remaining fuel. If your winter plan depends on purchased coal, then the fire in front of you reaches far beyond the walls. It reaches to a mine, a railroad car, a station, a dealer, a wagon, and finally your own fuel bin. Break any link and the stove still works. It simply has less to eat. Nebraska settlers learned this dependency early. The state never developed large coal supplies of its own, while expanding rail networks gradually made imported coal cheap enough that many households could rely on it more heavily. By around 1900, that growing railroad network had reduced much of the earlier dependence on hay, cornstalks, cobs, and animal dung for fuel. That sounds like progress. It was, but progress changes the shape of vulnerability. A family burning cow chips depends heavily on local labour and weather during collection. A family burning railroad coal depends more heavily on money, transportation, and supply. One system can fail because the chips got wet. The other can fail because the train never came. You cannot call either one independent. The difference is where the dependency sits. Outside, snow has begun filling the cuts along a rail line. Wind pushes loose powder into every place where terrain, fences, embankments, or structures slow it down. If enough snow accumulates, rails disappear beneath compacted drifts. Then locomotives need help. Crews shovel, plows push, engines strain, and sometimes the line remains closed. For a distant farm, you may know none of this immediately. You only know the dealer in town has less coal than expected. That shortage changes behaviour before the bin becomes empty. You burn more carefully. You close off space. You return to fuels you would rather not use. Corn cobs become useful again. Cornstalks become fuel. Hay can be twisted into compact bundles so it feeds a stove more efficiently than loose grass. Dried manure becomes less embarrassing when the alternative is a cold room. History Nebraska records exactly this kind of experimentation on the treeless plains. Loose hay demanded nearly constant tending, so settlers devised tighter bundles and even special hay-burning stoves. Cornstalks were bundled for the same reason. Cow and buffalo chips, where available, burned quickly but produced useful hot coals. Notice what scarcity does. It does not always create a new resource. It changes the category of an old one. The thing under your boot yesterday becomes fuel today. The corn cob left after dinner becomes stored heat. The stalk left after harvest becomes part of the winter reserve. A household under pressure begins seeing energy everywhere, but substitutes are not equal. Burning corn as fuel may sound absurd when corn is food, feed, seed, and something that can be sold. Yet historical Nebraska newspapers sometimes discussed exactly that calculation when corn prices were very low and coal or wood were expensive to transport. Now warmth collides with economics. Do you burn something you could eat? Feed to animals? Sell? Save for planting? The stove does not understand opportunity cost. It only understands combustion. That is why winter poverty can force choices that look irrational from a distance and perfectly rational from beside an empty coal bin. A cheap crop may be more valuable as heat than as merchandise if the cost of hauling another fuel is higher. A cow chip may be more valuable than its social dignity. A room that is 20 degrees colder may be more valuable than burning the last reserve too soon. Scarcity rearranges value. This reaches beyond fuel. Suppose rail service is delayed and the store in town begins running low. The household becomes more dependent on what was preserved at home. Flour matters more, salt matters more, feed matters more, lamp fuel matters more. Replacement stove parts matter enormously if something breaks. Even a small metal fitting can become difficult to obtain if the line that normally carries goods into town is blocked. The frontier household may look materially simple, but simplicity does not mean every object can be made locally. Iron stoves came from manufacturers. Glass came from elsewhere. Nails came from elsewhere. Many tools came from elsewhere. Coal often came from elsewhere. The homestead is local in land and labour, but regional or national in supply. Winter exposes that contradiction. You can build walls from prairie soil and still depend on distant industry to heat them. You can raise your own food and still need a manufactured stovepipe. You can own 160 acres and still be one broken iron part away from asking a neighbour for help. The deeper lesson is not that homesteaders failed at self-sufficiency. It is that complete self-sufficiency was mostly the wrong model. What mattered was redundancy. If coal failed, perhaps grass remained. If grass was poor, perhaps cobs. If your tools failed, perhaps a neighbour had another. If your pantry was short, perhaps someone could trade. If the road to town closed, perhaps stored supplies could carry you until it opened again. The household survived not by having one perfect solution, but by having several imperfect ones. That is a very different kind of resilience. It is messy. It smells worse. It requires storage. It requires knowing what can substitute for what. And it works only while enough alternatives remain. You feed another twisted bundle into the stove. The flame catches fast, then begins consuming the material faster than a dense piece of wood would. That means another bundle will be needed soon. Convenience disappears before heat disappears. This matters because inconvenience consumes labour. A stove that must be fed frequently keeps someone near it. A substitute fuel that creates more ash requires more cleaning. A bulky fuel occupies more storage. A poor burning fuel may demand better draft. Every substitute solves one problem by creating smaller ones. That pattern has been following us all winter. Warmth is never free. You pay in fuel, or labour, or money, or space, or smoke, or time. Sometimes you pay in all of them. And now the household has reached a larger truth. The prairie did not turn homesteaders into isolated masters of nature. It made them systems managers. They watched weather, managed fuel, stored food, maintained animals, used neighbours, relied on towns, watched prices, waited for transportation, improvised when one link failed. The warm room at the centre of the story is the final output of all those decisions, not the beginning. By evening, the train still has not come, but the fire has not gone out either. That is success for today. Tomorrow may require a different fuel. The day after that may require a trip to a neighbour. And if the cold continues long enough, the most difficult decision may no longer be what to burn. It may be whether remaining on the homestead is worth the cost of keeping it alive at all. The hardest choice begins when the house is still standing. The stove still works. There is food left. The animals are alive. Nothing has failed completely. And yet the cost of keeping everything going has become larger than the household can comfortably carry. You feel it in the morning before you even leave the bed. The room is colder because fuel was rationed overnight. Your clothes are dry enough, but the boots beside the stove are stiff. Wind is pressing against the wall again. Someone has to feed the animals, and someone else has to bring in more fuel. The question is no longer whether the homestead can survive one more day. It probably can. The question is how many days like this the people can survive before the system begins consuming them faster than they can maintain it. That distinction matters. A farm can remain technically functional while the humans inside it are exhausted, sick, underfed, or simply running out of workable options. Historical records preserve exactly this kind of strain. Amos Edwin Donnell, a Nebraska homesteader in Sherman County, wrote during the winter of 1884 that temperatures had fallen to around 22 degrees below zero. He stayed by the fire in his sod house on Christmas Eve. Years later, after hard work, severe climate, and failing health, he left the homestead and moved his family to nearby Arcadia. That does not mean one cold Christmas drove him away. It means winter belonged to a larger calculation. A claim could fail slowly. Health deteriorates, crops disappoint, money tightens, livestock losses hurt, a well gives trouble, isolation becomes heavier. Then another winter arrives. At some point, endurance stops being a virtue if it only protects a losing arrangement. The Homestead Act offered land, but land was not a guarantee of success. A claimant had to meet legal requirements before receiving title. Claims that were abandoned before being proved up were known as relinquishments. and the land could return to government control for another settler to try. So leaving was part of the homesteading story too. The empty house you pass on the prairie may not represent cowardice. It may represent arithmetic completed. But before a family reaches that final decision, there are smaller retreats. You stop heating space you do not need. A door remains closed. Work that can wait is left undone. A trip to town is cancelled. A visit is postponed. An outdoor repair is accepted as tomorrow's problem. In the Western Nebraska diary of homesteader Con Wilson, one Thanksgiving with temperatures near zero and strong winds reduced the day to almost nothing. His brief judgment was wonderfully practical. They could do nothing all day. Sometimes staying warm means doing less. That sounds obvious, but it runs against the logic of a working farm. Farms reward timely labour. Animals cannot be postponed indefinitely. Repairs become larger when ignored. Yet a blizzard creates a new priority system. Necessary later. Not necessary. The third category suddenly becomes very large. You look through the window at a piece of equipment partly buried in drifted snow. Leave it. A fence section needs attention. Leave it for now. Something stored in an outbuilding would be useful. Not useful enough. This is not laziness. It is energy conservation expressed as scheduling. The body itself forces the rule. Every hour of hard work requires calories. Every wet glove must be dried. Every outdoor task increases exposure. A household with limited fuel cannot afford to create unnecessary drying work merely because a chore would normally be considered responsible. Winter rewrites responsibility. Then there is the option of moving people instead of moving heat. Suppose one household has a better shelter, more fuel, or more hands. Gathering under one roof can be more efficient than keeping two weak fires alive in two separate buildings. The historical record does not allow us to turn this into a universal frontier routine. Distances varied enormously, and severe storms could make travel to even a nearby house impossible. Some settlers lived miles from their closest neighbours, but the logic explains why shelter offered to travellers or stranded people mattered so much. During one 19th century Nebraska blizzard, a group of buffalo hunters found themselves with horses covered in snow and ice and no fuel for their campfires. They eventually followed a creek in search of settlement and found a sod house occupied by two English families who took them in. For the hunters, the critical resource was not better clothing. It was a different building. The storm had made their own arrangement fail, so survival required leaving it. That is the same substitution pattern again. When one fuel fails, use another. When vision fails, use a rope. When one shelter fails, find another. The prairie rewards loyalty to function, not loyalty to method. You can feel how far this is from the usual heroic picture. Heroic stories tell you to hold your ground. Winter sometimes tells you to abandon it. Not forever, maybe only for a night. Maybe only until the wind falls. Maybe only until someone repairs the stove. The important skill is recognizing which part of the system is worth saving first. People come before an empty room. Dry bedding comes before appearances. The milk cow may matter more than a frozen shed. A fuel reserve for dawn may matter more than comfort at midnight. This is triage without the word, and it works at the level of the whole homestead. Protect what preserves the most future options. A living person can rebuild a fence. A living animal can work in spring. Dry matches can restart a fire. Unburned fuel can be used tomorrow. A ruined outbuilding may be painful, but it is not always worth risking a life during whiteout conditions. The cold strips decisions down to consequences. That is why the idea of staying warm has now become much larger than temperature. It means preserving the ability to choose tomorrow. If you burn everything tonight, tomorrow has fewer choices. If you exhaust yourself today, tomorrow has fewer choices. If you walk into a storm for a replaceable object, tomorrow may disappear completely. So the household protects margins. A little fuel, a little food, a little strength, a route to another shelter, a neighbour who knows you need help. Nothing here looks like abundance. Margin is simply what remains after today takes its share. And sometimes the wisest use of that margin is retreat. You move closer to the stove. The wind can keep the unused corner of the room. It can keep the path to town. It can keep the fence repair until morning. For now, the household gives winter less surface to attack, less space, less movement, fewer demands. That is not defeat. It is the same strategy the sod wall has been using all along. Do not overpower the cold. Reduce what the cold is allowed to reach. And once that principle reaches the level of the entire farm, another question becomes unavoidable. If sod walls, small rooms, rationed fuel, altered work, neighbours, and even temporary retreat all function by reducing exposure, then what did homesteaders actually wear on the part of the system that could never stay indoors? Their own bodies. The body is the one room you cannot close for winter. You can shut a door behind you, you can bank earth against a wall, you can let an unused corner go cold, but the moment you step outside, the defended space becomes whatever you are wearing. So you begin at the feet. Boots that worked in dry autumn are not automatically good winter equipment. Snow melts against warm leather. Moisture works into socks. Then the temperature drops again, and what was merely damp becomes cold, stiff, and miserable. That is why drying footwear beside the stove mattered almost as much as owning it. You do not want boots scorched against hot iron. You want them near enough to lose moisture before morning. Dryness is insulation preserved. The same principle reaches upward. A shirt, another layer, a coat, something around the neck, a hat, mittens or gloves. The exact combination varied with region, money, family background, work, and what could be purchased or made. There was no single uniform called homesteader winter clothing, but the mechanism was consistent. Clothing works partly by trapping air near the body and slowing the movement of heat into colder surroundings. Several layers can trap more still air than one thin garment, while an outer layer that reduces wind keeps moving air from stripping that warmth away so quickly. Wool was valuable because it could be made into shirts, stockings, mittens, coats, blankets, and other cold weather goods. Families still had to obtain the materials somehow, whether by purchase, home production, trade, or older garments used until their remaining life became a matter of repair rather than fashion. That last part matters. Clothing was capital. A torn mitten was not automatically thrown away. It was mended. A worn coat might be patched. A garment too small for one child might continue its career on another. Historical accounts of homestead poverty describe settlers earning outside wages, specifically to buy necessities such as winter clothing and shoes. A reminder that even households producing much of their own food still needed cash for things the farm did not provide easily. Now you open the door, the first gust finds every mistake. A loose cuff becomes an entry point. An uncovered neck becomes an exposed surface. A gap at the waist reminds you that two good garments can still make one bad system if they do not overlap. So dressing for cold is not just a question of thickness, it is a question of continuity. Keep warm air from escaping too freely. Keep wind from entering too freely. Keep skin covered. Keep the clothing dry enough to continue doing its job, and do all of that while remaining able to work. That last requirement ruins every perfect solution. Wrap yourself in enough heavy material and you become clumsy. Work hard in too many layers and you sweat. Sweat wets clothing from the inside. Then, when the work stops, the moisture helps pull heat away, so the body creates its own winter paradox. You need insulation to work outside. Working generates heat. Too much retained heat creates moisture. The moisture can become a problem when movement slows. The practical answer is adjustment. Open something. Remove a layer if conditions allow. Put it back on before standing still. A homesteader would not describe this in modern outdoor recreation language, but anyone performing physical labor in cold weather had to learn the body's feedback quickly. You know when you are overheating. You know when your fingers are becoming useless. You know when a wet sock has begun to matter, and fingers matter very early. A mitten sacrifices dexterity for warmth because keeping fingers together reduces the surface exposed around each one and lets them share a warmer enclosed space. A glove offers better individual movement but separates the fingers. Either way, the hands have work to do. Tie a rope, lift a bucket, open a latch, handle harness, break ice, carry fuel. You cannot simply bury your hands in your pockets until spring. This is why cold becomes dangerous before dramatic frost injury appears. Dexterity declines, knots become harder, buttons become annoying, metal tools feel vicious against bare skin. A small repair takes longer. Longer work means longer exposure. The loop turns against you. You can see how the entire household supports the clothing system. Someone sews, someone patches, someone dries garments, someone buys cloth or finished goods when money allows. Someone hands down older pieces. Children contribute labor elsewhere, and every saved dollar or repaired garment may postpone another purchase. The stove therefore maintains clothes, and clothes allow the labor that maintains the stove. Another loop. Now you reach the barn. Your shoulders are warm because you have been moving, but your feet are beginning to cool. Inside, the wind disappears. Immediately, you have a decision. Keep everything buttoned and risk sweating while lifting feed, or loosen the outer layer while you work and close it again before stepping outside. Warmth has become active management. It is not something clothes simply give you. You regulate it. That is especially important because different parts of the body face different problems. The torso generates substantial heat during work. Hands and feet are farther from that central warmth and can become difficult to keep comfortable. The face is exposed because you need to see and breathe. Wet cuffs collect snow. Boots must protect against ground cold while still allowing walking. Every body part negotiates a different boundary with winter. Then there is the wagon or sleigh. Now your problem changes completely. While walking, muscles create heat. While sitting, they do much less. A journey that felt manageable during loading can become punishing once you are stationary and moving air. This is where heavy coverings and robes become more important. One Nebraska recollection described buffalo robes as common warm wraps in farmers' rigs, sometimes carried year-round as wagon seat padding and prized for protection in winter weather. You pull a covering across your knees. The horse supplies the motion now. You supply very little heat through work. The wind supplies the rest of the lesson. Movement is warmer than waiting. That simple fact influences winter behavior everywhere. Do the job. Keep moving. Do not stand outside discussing what can be discussed indoors. Prepare before opening the door. Know what you are carrying. Know where you are going. The clothes buy time, but they do not make exposure free. And once you understand clothing this way, a surprising thing happens to the whole story. The sod wall and the mitten begin to look like the same technology. Both trap or protect a warmer interior. The barn does it around animals. The coat does it around the torso. The quilt does it around a sleeping body. At every scale, homesteaders are building boundaries against moving heat. The difference is that one boundary has to walk. That makes the body the most fragile shelter on the farm. A house can wait through a storm. A person outside has a clock running, which means the next question is not what people wore when they had to leave the stove. It is what happened when they stayed outside too long, and how families recognized the moment ordinary cold had become an emergency. The warning often begins in the hands. Not pain, the opposite. You have been outside long enough that the fingers stop complaining as loudly as they did when you first opened the door. For a moment, that can feel like improvement. It is not. Cold can reduce sensation and dexterity before a person fully understands how much trouble is developing. Modern medicine distinguishes local freezing injury, or frostbite, from hypothermia, in which the body's core temperature falls dangerously low. Homesteaders did not need those modern labels to notice the practical signs that mattered most. A hand stops working properly, a foot becomes numb, a person starts fumbling with a latch that should be easy, the job takes longer. That is the trap. The colder you become, the harder it can be to perform the small actions required to get warm again. You are standing at the barn door with a wooden bucket in one hand and a stiff glove in the other. The latch catches. Normally, you would solve it in seconds. Now your fingers feel thick and slow. You take off the mitten because bare fingers can grip better. Immediately, you have traded warmth for dexterity. That trade appears everywhere in winter work. Mittens are warmer, but tools are easier to handle with separated fingers. Heavy layers conserve heat, but make movement slower. A scarf protects the face, but moisture from breathing can dampen it. A person working hard may open a coat to avoid sweating, then forget to close it before standing still. Cold does not need one spectacular mistake. It can accumulate several reasonable decisions. This is why returning indoors before you feel desperate is so important. Once the body is deeply chilled, judgment itself can worsen. Modern weather guidance lists intense shivering, exhaustion, fumbling hands, confusion, memory problems, slurred speech and drowsiness among signs of hypothermia. The frightening part is that several of those symptoms interfere with the very decision-making needed to seek shelter. A person in trouble may not behave like someone who knows they are in trouble. That changes the role of everyone else. Warmth becomes social observation. You come through the door and somebody looks at you. Not because the household has a thermometer ready to diagnose hypothermia, because they know your normal movements. They can see whether you are shaking badly, whether your speech sounds wrong, whether you are dropping things, whether you answer sensibly, whether your clothes are wet. The people around the stove become part of the warning system. The first response to ordinary chilling is obvious enough. Get out of the wind. Remove or replace wet layers if dry ones are available. Bring the person into the warmer zone. Use blankets and clothing. Give the body time. Modern cold weather guidance still begins with these same principles: shelter, dryness, and gradual warming. But 19th century households did not possess modern emergency medicine, and some old cold injury practices would now be considered harmful. That makes prevention even more important in the homestead setting. Do not wait until rescue becomes a medical problem. Avoid creating the emergency. You can see how the entire farm has been designed around that idea. The rope to the barn prevents wandering. The dry mittens prevent loss of hand function. The stored fuel prevents an unnecessary trip. The small warm room shortens recovery. The early feeding of animals prevents a later journey in worse weather. Everything is trying to keep exposure on the safe side of a line that no one can see precisely. Then you notice the feet. They are harder to monitor. Hands can be held near the body. Fingers can be inspected. Feet disappear into socks and boots, where dampness, pressure, and cold ground can work quietly. A person may continue walking on numb feet because walking itself creates some warmth, and because the chore still needs finishing. Then they come indoors and discover how cold those feet became. This is another reason boots are not merely clothing. They are working equipment with a maintenance cycle: dry, patch, grease or care for the leather when appropriate. Replace worn socks. Keep snow from entering at the top. A leak in a boot can be almost as relevant to winter labour as a leak in a roof. Both allow the environment to cross a boundary that was supposed to hold it out. And again, poverty matters. It is easy to say that someone should simply wear better footwear or add another dry layer. That assumes another pair exists. A homesteading household operating with little cash may have to stretch clothing through repairs and hand-me-downs because shoes, cloth, coats, and manufactured goods cost money. Cold therefore magnifies small material inequalities. A person with 2 pairs of usable mittens can dry one while wearing the other. A person with only 1 pair has a different problem. A child whose boots fit badly does not experience the same winter as an adult with sound footwear. A household with spare blankets can wrap a chilled traveller without stripping a bed. Reserves appear again. Not fuel this time. Fabric, leather, dryness. You step closer to the stove. The temptation is to press numb hands directly toward the hottest iron. But numbness makes extreme heat difficult to judge. Modern frostbite guidance warns against direct, intense heat because injured tissue can burn before normal sensation returns. gentle warming is safer. The historical household might not understand the physiology, but it certainly understands that the stove is powerful enough to scorch clothing, skin, and anything left carelessly against it. So the warm zone must be managed too. The same object that protects you from winter can injure you if used badly. That is true of fire throughout the homestead. A hotter stove is not automatically a safer stove. More fuel is not automatically better. More clothing is not automatically better if it becomes soaked with sweat. The entire system works by balance rather than maximum effort. Now imagine the person who does not come back on time. The barn chore should have taken 20 minutes. 40 have passed. The wind is louder. Visibility is worse. Suddenly the problem changes from warming someone who returned cold to deciding whether another person should leave shelter to search for them. That is one of winter's cruelest equations. Rescue creates another exposed body. A rope or known route can reduce that risk close to the farm, but beyond those marked connections the prairie becomes much less forgiving. So families learn to notice time. Where are you going? How long should it take? When should you be back? Ordinary conversation becomes safety procedure. The principle is simple enough that it hardly sounds like technology. Do not let a person disappear into weather without anyone noticing. The warm house needs to know who is outside, because once cold begins affecting hands, feet, speech, memory, and judgment, the most important survival tool may no longer be carried by the person in danger. It may be the person waiting beside the stove who realizes the door should have opened 10 minutes ago. And that leads us to the most frightening kind of prairie cold. Not the cold you can feel while standing in it. The cold that becomes dangerous because, little by little, you stop feeling how dangerous it is. The dangerous part of a stove is that it feels like safety. You come in from the cold, close the door, and move toward the iron. The room is dim. Your hands begin to work again. Snow melts from your coat. For the first time in an hour, the prairie seems to have lost. So naturally, you want more heat. Another stick, another bundle of grass, another handful of chips. Push the fire harder. That instinct is understandable, but a homestead stove is not a bottomless machine. The hotter you drive it, the hotter the stovepipe becomes. Sparks can escape. Nearby wood can overheat. Cloth hung too close can scorch. A loose joint can leak smoke. Creosote and soot in a chimney or pipe can create their own danger. The object keeping winter out can set the house on fire. This matters especially because many frontier homes combine several vulnerable materials in a small space. A sod house might have thick earthen walls, but its roof could contain poles, brush, boards, or other combustible material. A frame house offered even more wood, bedding, clothing, furniture, stored fuel, and dry household goods crowded around the same source of heat. There is not much distance between warmth and ignition, so you do not simply make the stove as hot as possible. You manage it. The fire needs enough draft to burn properly. The pipe needs to carry smoke outside. Ash has to be removed. Fuel has to be kept close enough to use, but not so close that a stray spark reaches it. And somebody has to stay aware. That is easy during supper. It is harder at 2 in the morning. The household has already spent the day carrying water, feeding animals, hauling fuel, cooking, mending, and fighting the wind. Everyone is tired, yet the heating system may still require attention through the night. A fire allowed to die completely means a colder morning and more work restarting it. A fire pushed too hard creates another kind of risk. So once again, survival lives between extremes. Before bed, you prepare the stove for a slower burn if the fuel allows it. You arrange what tomorrow morning will need. Matches or lighting materials stay where they can be found in darkness. Fuel is placed within reach. Then the room quiets. This is when the house reveals another hidden problem. Warmth makes people seal openings. Smoke requires openings to work correctly. A stove is supposed to send combustion gases up the pipe and outside, but poor draft, blockage, leaks, or badly functioning equipment can allow smoke into the room. 19th century families understood smoky stoves in the most immediate possible way. Eyes sting, the room smells wrong, soot settles where it should not. They did not possess a modern carbon monoxide alarm to announce an invisible combustion problem. That makes ventilation and a functioning flue more than matters of comfort. The heating system must breathe while the household tries to stop the house from breathing too much. Too many gaps and the prairie wind enters. Too little controlled airflow and combustion becomes troublesome. This is the same compromise we met earlier, but now the consequence is sharper. A tight house conserves heat. A working stove needs draft. The answer is not perfect sealing, it is controlled leakage. You want air to move where the fire requires it, not through every crack around the door and window. That turns maintenance into thermal engineering. A damaged door wastes fuel. A faulty stovepipe threatens the room. A poor roof can admit moisture. Wet fuel burns badly. Ash accumulation interferes with the work of the stove. The winter house is constantly asking its occupants to repair boundaries. And because materials expand, contract, dry, swell, crack, and shift, yesterday's repair is not necessarily permanent. The prairie is working on the building even while you sleep. Wind pushes, snow loads the roof, cold contracts metal, thaws introduce water, then freezing returns. A home is not a finished object. It is an ongoing job. That is especially obvious in sod construction. Thick prairie walls can buffer temperature and resist wind surprisingly well. But roofs were often the difficult part. Water could find its way through imperfect coverings. Dirt could fall. Rodents and insects were hardly impressed by the romance of frontier architecture. A wet roof creates a heating problem in several ways at once. Bedding can become damp. Clothing can become damp. Stored fuel can become damp. A person must spend labour repairing the leak. And the stove may now be asked to dry everything. One failure has increased heat demand while reducing the household's ability to meet it. That pattern is dangerous because it can cascade. Imagine a roof leak above a pile of grass fuel. The fuel burns poorly. The room cools. More fuel must be handled. Someone goes outside for another reserve. Their clothing gets wet. Now more things need drying. The stove is pushed harder. A small building problem has become a labour problem, a fuel problem, and an exposure problem. The successful household tries to interrupt that chain early. Move the fuel, catch the water, patch what you can, dry the bedding, keep tomorrow from inheriting a larger version of tonight. This is why the strongest winter skill is often not endurance. It is noticing. Notice the draft before the room becomes cold. Notice the wet mitten before morning. Notice the pipe joint before smoke fills the room. Notice the shrinking fuel pile before the storm closes the road. Notice the animal that is not eating. Notice the person who has been outside too long. The entire homestead is a collection of small signals. Ignore enough of them, and winter becomes an emergency. Respond early, and the same weather may remain merely exhausting. You wake sometime before dawn. The stove has quieted. The iron is still warm. No smoke hangs in the room. No spark has found the bedding. The roof is holding. For a moment, nothing needs fixing. That absence of trouble is the result of hundreds of previous choices. Then you hear the wind again. Morning is coming, and with it the same chores. But something has changed in our picture of warmth. The stove is no longer the hero at the centre of the house. It is one component in a larger design. Walls control loss. Clothing controls loss. Work controls exposure. Storage controls timing. Neighbours provide redundancy. Maintenance prevents cascading failure. The stove converts fuel into heat. But everything around it determines whether that heat becomes survival or waste. And homesteaders did not stop learning this after one winter. As settlements lasted, money arrived, railroads expanded, trees grew around established farms, buildings improved, and families gained experience, the winter system itself began to change. The prairie stayed cold. But the homestead did not stay the same. The farm looks different after 10 winters. Not transformed, not protected, just less exposed. The first year, the house may have stood almost alone against open grass. By the 10th, there may be a better roof, a tighter door, a larger barn, a deeper fuel reserve, and trees where there used to be nothing tall enough to interrupt the wind. That difference matters because winter is not only something a homesteader survives, it is something a homestead learns from. You can see the learning first in placement. A new claimant may build where water, soil, legal boundaries, and immediate convenience allow. An experienced family begins noticing where snow drifts, which wall takes the hardest wind, where the sun reaches in winter, and which route to the barn becomes miserable during storms. The land teaches by repetition. After one bad winter, you remember the door that drifted shut. After 2, you may change how the path is kept. After several, a building placed slightly differently begins to look less like preference and more like stored experience. In parts of Nebraska, later surveys recorded houses and barns built from both sod and wood, with some homes deliberately placed on the lee side of dunes or hills for protection from wind. By the 1890s, planted trees and sheltering rows were also being promoted around farmsteads, while railroad access made lumber increasingly available farther west. Now the prairie has acquired edges, a hill breaks the wind, a barn protects a yard. A row of trees begins slow in moving air before it reaches the house. None of these things heats the kitchen. They reduce the rate at which the landscape removes heat from everything living there. That is the same mechanism we have been following from the beginning. But now the boundary has moved outward. The first boundary was clothing, then walls, then the barn. Now part of the farm itself becomes a wind management system. Tree planting became important enough on the Great Plains that Congress passed the Timber Culture Act in 1873. The law offered additional land under requirements that claimants plant and cultivate trees, although the program was widely abused and far less successful than its designers hoped. The original rule called for 40 acres of trees on a 160-acre claim. Later amendments reduced that requirement. The law did not magically cover the plains in forest. Many plantings failed. Dry weather, grasshoppers, poor methods, and simple neglect could defeat them. But the idea itself tells you something. People recognized that treelessness was not merely an aesthetic problem. Trees meant material, fuel, posts, shade, and potentially wind protection. At Daniel Freeman's Nebraska homestead, an Osage orange hedge planted in roughly the 1875 to 1885 period stretched for about 3/4 of a mile along one boundary. The National Park Service notes that it marked the property and conserved timber resources, and may also have functioned as a windbreak. Imagine that hedge when it is young. It does almost nothing. A line of small plants cannot bargain effectively with a January wind. Years pass, roots deepen, branches thicken. The same decision becomes more useful without anyone rebuilding it. That is unusual in our story. Most winter resources disappear when used. Coal becomes ash, hay becomes manure, food becomes energy. A planted tree can become more valuable with time. A mature farm therefore contains investments made by earlier versions of the household. The fence fixed 5 summers ago, the barn enlarged after the second child was born, the grove planted when the house was still new. The better stove purchased when a good harvest finally left some cash. These things convert memory into infrastructure. Then the railroad changes the fire. Earlier households on the treeless plains often relied on whatever local fuel they could gather. As rail networks expanded, imported coal became increasingly practical. By the early 20th century, coal had become a major household heating fuel in Nebraska, supported by dealers who moved it in large quantities through the rail system. This can make the daily room easier to manage. Coal is dense. It can burn longer than loose grass. It reduces the constant need to feed bulky plant fuel into a stove. That saves labor, and saved labor changes the rest of winter. Someone who is not twisting grass for fuel can do another job. Someone who does not have to gather as many cow chips can spend that time repairing harness, tending animals, or simply recovering from work. A better fuel therefore buys more than heat. It buys attention, but it also ties the household more tightly to cash and transport. The warmer, easier house may now depend on a coal dealer, and a functioning rail line. Improvement has not eliminated dependency, it has relocated it again. The same is true of lumber. When sawn boards become easier to obtain, a family may replace or expand older structures. A frame initial can provide more light, cleaner surfaces, and more conventional rooms. It can also create more space to heat. So the family learns another lesson. Comfort and thermal efficiency do not always move together. A small sod room can be cramped and still resist temperature change well. A larger frame house can feel like prosperity while asking the stove to defend more surface area. The answer is not to reject improvement. It is to improve the whole system. Better construction, tighter joints, better windows, reliable fuel, a stove suited to the space, storm protection around the building. This is where the homestead stops looking like an emergency shelter and begins looking like a settled farm. The distinction is important. A first winter may be survived through improvisation. A 10th winter should contain fewer surprises. Not because weather has become kinder, because experience has been built into objects. You know where the drift forms, you store fuel differently, you keep a spare part, you stack hay instead of gambling on easy access. You plant something where the wind hurts most. You move a daily task closer if distance proved costly. Even the children growing older change the thermal economy. More capable hands can carry fuel. Older children can help with animals. Skills no longer have to be explained each time. A person who has lived through several severe winters recognizes the sound of a worsening wind, the feel of badly dried clothing, the danger of a shrinking reserve. Experience reduces reaction time. That may be one of the least visible forms of warmth on the farm. You cannot touch it, but it prevents doors from being opened at the wrong moment. It prevents a fuel pile from being left unprotected. It tells you that a mild morning can still become a brutal afternoon. It tells you when not to go. The mature homestead has therefore expanded its defenses in two directions at once. Outward, into barns, trees, roots, storage and supply networks. Inward, into habits. By now, the prairie has not become less cold. The household has simply given the cold fewer easy victories. And that brings us close to the answer promised by the title. Because after following walls, fuel, clothing, livestock, neighbors, railroads, trees, and experience, it is becoming clear that homesteaders did not stay warm through one ingenious frontier trick. They stayed warm by building layers of imperfect protection around a very small source of heat. But before we can finish that idea, there is one last layer to examine. The layer that changed every other one. Money. Money does not warm a room. Not directly. You cannot shovel coins into a stove and expect much useful heat. But money decides how often you have to improvise. It decides whether the fuel pile is coal or grass, whether there is a second pair of boots drying beside the first, whether a cracked stove part can be replaced. That is why winter begins separating households long before the thermometer reaches its lowest point. The Homestead Act made land sound almost free. For a standard 160-acre claim, the federal filing costs were small enough to be famous, roughly $18 in total under the original process. But the land still had to be occupied, improved, cultivated, supplied, and held through years of weather before a claimant could prove up. The government price of entry was low. The cost of turning acreage into a functioning farm was not. You can see that cost by standing in the yard. The house required material or labor. The well required digging. The fence required posts, wire, or both. The stove had to come from somewhere. So did iron tools, glass, shoes, coats, lamps, nails, and replacement parts. A family could grow food and still need cash. National Park Service teaching material describes Plains women selling butter and eggs to supplement household income, while other homesteaders worked as domestics or took wage labor to earn money that the claim itself could not yet provide. Now imagine what a few dollars can mean in January. Not wealth, choice. A little cash may buy coal instead of forcing another day of gathering poor fuel. It may buy cloth, shoes, lamp oil, a stove fitting, feed. The important thing is not that every family bought the same goods. They did not. It is that cash converts one problem into several possible solutions. Without it, the household has to solve more problems using only what is physically nearby. That increases dependence on labor, and labor is already being consumed by winter. You reach the fuel pile. A prosperous household may have purchased enough dense fuel before the weather turned severe. Another household may be stretching grass cobs, manure, or a modest reserve of wood because money was needed elsewhere. Both fires can produce heat, but they do not demand the same amount of attention. Dense fuel can buy hours. Bulky fuel buys warmth in smaller installments. That difference becomes visible at night. One person sleeps longer, another wakes to feed the stove. One family opens the door less often. Another goes outside again because the indoor reserve was too small. Money has turned into sleep, then into reduced exposure, then into health. This is how class enters the body without announcing itself. A better coat is not merely a nicer possession. It extends useful time outdoors. A sound pair of boots reduces wet feet. A spare blanket enlarges the safe margin around a cold night. A well-built barn reduces what animals lose to the wind. A larger hay reserve protects livestock that will provide traction or income later. The financial advantage compounds because each good resource protects another. The opposite can compound too. If cash is short, a family may postpone a repair. The repair becomes larger. A draft wastes fuel. Fuel runs down faster. Someone has to gather more. One shortage produces another. This is why calling the land free can be misleading, even without challenging the legal language of the Homestead Act. One claimant, Matilda Robinson, paid $18 in filing fees for her Nebraska homestead, but by the time improvements on her claim were recorded, she had a sod frame house, stable, corn crib, chicken house, cellar, pens, fencing, a 105-foot well, and 48 cultivated acres valued together at hundreds of dollars. The filing fee opened the door. Building a viable farm required an entirely different scale of investment. An investment did not guarantee success. Weather could erase a crop. Drought could reduce both food and cash income. Low prices could leave produce abundant but nearly worthless at market. An animal could die. Then winter arrives while the household is already weakened. This is when relief records become especially revealing. During the drought and financial hardship of 1893 and 1894, western Nebraska settlers suffered badly enough that charitable and fraternal organizations appealed for food, clothing, and fuel. One Grand Army of the Republic appeal specifically asked communities to send coal and other necessities to distressed families before winter suffering became worse. Coal in that relief appeal is more than coal. It is the difference between having a market solution and being priced out of it. The railroad may be functioning perfectly. The dealer may have fuel. But if the household has no money, the supply chain still ends before the stove. That is a different kind of isolation. So households create cash where they can. Sell eggs, sell butter, take seasonal work, work for another farmer, trade labor, sell livestock if necessary. The exact combination varies, but the principle remains. A homestead has to interact with a cash economy because some winter necessities arrive from beyond the claim that changes who does what inside the household. A person earning wages away from the farm may bring home money but remove labor from daily chores. Someone else absorbs those chores. A woman selling butter and eggs converts domestic and farm work into purchasing power. Children gathering fuel reduce the amount the household has to buy. Winter eventually translates all of them into the same question. What does this allow us not to lose? Money can also buy distance from risk. More storage allows purchases before roads close. A better built house means fewer emergency repairs during storms. A family with margin can prepare early. A family without margin is forced to wait until the need becomes urgent. Urgency is expensive. The worst time to gather fuel is when the fuel is needed immediately. The worst time to repair a roof is during the storm. The worst time to buy winter clothing is after the cold has arrived and the road is blocked. Money cannot stop the weather. It can move work into safer seasons, spend in autumn, and January requires fewer exposed hours. Buy coal early, repair the stove early, replace the boot early, store feed early. The result is not simply comfort, it is fewer decisions made under pressure. Now look again at the small room around the stove. At first, it seemed like a story about toughness and improvised fuel. Then walls appeared. Clothing, animals, neighbours, railroads, markets, and now cash. Each layer has made the lone homesteader smaller. That is useful, because the myth of complete self-sufficiency hides the real achievement. Homesteaders survived when they could combine local knowledge, household labour, stored resources, purchased goods, social help, and infrastructure into one working system. Some had far more margin than others. Some did not make it. Some left. Some prospered enough to replace the first sod house with something larger and tighter. Winter did not judge effort alone, it judged the whole arrangement. And now, with only one step left, we can finally answer the title without reducing everything we have seen to "they burned cow chips" or "they lived in sod houses." Those things mattered, but they were pieces. The real answer is a pattern repeated from the mitten on your hand to the railroad beyond the horizon, a pattern of conserving, concentrating, substituting, and preparing before the cold could make every choice more expensive. By now, the answer is almost visible before anyone says it. The house is still small, the stove is still iron, the wind is still outside, but everything around those three facts has changed. You have watched a prairie household gather fuel before winter, protect it from weather, bring it indoors in small amounts, and feed it carefully into a stove that can only produce so much heat. You have watched thick walls slow that heat from escaping, clothing trap it around the body, bedding trap it even closer, and barns do the same work for animals by blocking wind. You have watched people shorten routes, mark paths, combine chores, dry boots, patch mittens, store hay, keep water moving, repair roofs, clear stovepipes, borrow tools, help neighbours, depend on railroads, buy coal when money allowed, and fall back on grass, cobs, dung, or other substitutes when it did not. No single object carried the household through winter. Not the sod wall, not the stove, not the quilt, not the coal scuttle, not the buffalo robe across a wagon seat. Each one solved only part of the same problem. Heat had to be made, then protected, then concentrated, then carried through work without being wasted faster than it could be replaced. That is how homesteaders stayed warm when the prairie turned to ice. They built layers around a limited fire. The important word is limited. A stove could not heat the plains. It could not make the barnyard gentle. It could not keep a road open or stop a blizzard from erasing the horizon. So the household kept reducing the size of the problem until the heat available was enough for the space that mattered most. First, the walls, then the occupied room, then the circle around the stove, then the coat, then the blanket, then the bed. The colder the world became, the smaller the defended space could become. And when that was still not enough, the family reduced something else. Movement, work, distance, exposure. A trip was delayed, 2 chores became 1. A broken fence waited, an animal was fed before the storm worsened. Fuel was brought inside before dark, a rope went between the house and barn. Warmth came from preparation as much as combustion. That is why the story changes when you stop looking only at the flames. A dramatic fire is easy to see. The invisible work is harder. The summer afternoon when someone gathers chips, the autumn day when hay is stacked properly, the evening when a coat is patched, the hour spent sealing a draft, the decision to bring in an extra bucket before the wind rises, the money saved for coal, the neighbour who lends a tool, the child who carries fuel, the adult who decides not to walk into a whiteout for something that can wait. Every one of those choices makes the stove more effective, without making the stove any hotter. That is the system, and systems create inequalities as well as solutions. A family with a better roof needs less repair. A family with cash can buy denser fuel. A household with spare clothing can stay drier. A farm with several capable workers can spread the chores. A newly arrived claimant with little money, poor shelter, few animals, and no nearby help is living through a different winter, even when the temperature is exactly the same. The prairie distributes cold widely. It does not distribute protection evenly. That is why some families endured, some prospered, some needed relief, and some eventually left. Survival was never a simple test of character. The weather did not measure courage. It measured insulation, fuel, timing, labor, health, distance, money, storage, judgment, and luck. Character mattered because people still had to make decisions inside those limits. But determination could not turn wet grass into dry fuel. It could not make a blizzard visible. It could not replace a dead animal or rebuild an exhausted body overnight. The more carefully we look, the less frontier survival resembles a contest between tough people and bad weather. It looks more like a household constantly negotiating with physics. Do not lose heat faster than you can make it. Do not spend fuel where a blanket will do. Do not spend body heat where preparation can eliminate the trip. Do not spend tomorrow's reserve to make tonight unnecessarily comfortable. Do not confuse endurance with refusing to retreat. And do not assume the person nearest the stove is the only one keeping it burning. There are hands behind every warm room. Some gathered, some cut, some hauled, some cooked, some mended, some fed animals, some earned cash, some carried news, some opened their door to another person when the storm made distance dangerous. The warm centre of the homestead was built by all of them. Now the day is ending again. The last outdoor chore has been done. The barn door is closed, feed is where it needs to be, snow has been knocked from boots before they cross the threshold. The house receives you with no sudden miracle of comfort. It is simply less cold than outside, and tonight, that is enough. The stove gives a quiet metal tick. Someone places tomorrow morning's fuel close by. Wet things have been moved to dry. The door is checked once. The wind presses against it from the other side. This is the same door that resisted you at the beginning of the night. It still does. The prairie has not learned mercy while we were talking. The cold is still larger than the house. The wind is still stronger than any person standing alone in it. But that was never the contest. Inside, the room has grown quieter. The farm beyond the walls can wait for morning. The unused corner is cold. No one needs it. The ceiling is cold. No one needs that either. Near the stove, one small zone remains warm enough. Soon even that will matter less. The family moves toward bed. Layers that worked during the day become layers folded nearby for morning. Blankets settle over bodies. The defended space contracts one last time. House, room, bed, body. Beneath the covers, the air begins to warm from the people already there. No shovel has to move it. No wagon has to carry it. No railroad has to deliver it. For a few hours, the system has become almost perfectly small. Outside, snow slides softly against the wall. The wall does not defeat the winter. It only slows it. The blanket does the same. So does the coat hanging nearby. So did the barn. So did the rope. So did the fuel stack prepared months ago. Different objects, one idea, keep enough warmth close to what must survive. The breathing in the room becomes slower. The stove dims. Its iron holds a little heat after the flame has settled. Nothing is being conquered now. Nothing needs to be. Beyond the door, the prairie can stretch white and frozen all the way to the horizon. Inside, under a roof made by tired hands, a small pocket of warmth remains exactly where it is needed. And for tonight, that is enough.